"You're coming with me," the cowboy said, seeing the pregnant widow struggling to pull the wagon with 5 children. Arizona Territory, 1883. The Arizona sun showed no mercy. By midday, the earth along the narrow dirt road had cracked open like old pottery, each fracture filled with powdery dust that swirled with every faint gust. The wind carried sand sharp enough to sting, scraping across skin already burned raw. Heat shimmered off the ground in trembling waves. June Whitaker trudged forward anyway. Barefoot, 7 months pregnant, her breath came out in short, ragged bursts. Sweat darkened the back of her faded dress until it clung to her spine. Her lips were split. Her hands, wrapped around a makeshift rope harness, trembled as she dragged the broken wagon behind her. Each step sent pain up her swollen legs, but she didn't stop. 5 children followed her, some clinging to the wagon, others huddled inside the creaking wooden frame. The first was her daughter, 5 years old, curls limp from heat, small fingers gripping the side rail as if afraid the world might lift her away. The second was the infant, only 4 months old, cradled against June's chest in a worn sling. His breaths were shallow, his hunger constant. The other 3 were not hers, though June held them as if they were. Orphans of the attack, children whose parents had screamed, run, fallen, and never stood again. Children June had found shaking beneath the overturned remains of a wagon 2 nights ago. She had pressed them close, wiped their tears, and told them to come along. She couldn't bury their parents, she couldn't save her husband either, but she could save the children, or try. The horse that once pulled their wagon lay miles behind them, collapsed on the trail, starved, dehydrated, pushed to the brink by terror and distance. June had closed its eyes before tying the rope around her own waist. The bandits had taken everything else, food, water, tools, and left the survivors to the desert. "Miss June?" A small voice called from the wagon. It was one of the orphaned girls, thin as a reed, knees tucked tight to her chest. Her voice quivered. Are we leftovers? Something nobody wanted." June's steps faltered. Her throat burned with more than thirst. Her eyes filled, but the desert heat dried the tears before they could fall. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She could not say no, though she wanted to. She could not soothe them, though she tried to find words. She kept walking. The silence was an answer the children didn't deserve. Her knees buckled slightly. The rope cut deeper into her shoulder. For a moment, she swayed dangerously, her vision narrowing at the edges. The infant whimpered. The 5-year-old gasped, and the wagon lurched behind her. Then tiny arms wrapped around her leg. "Mama," her daughter said, voice small but fierce. June looked down at the child, dust on her cheeks, determination burning in her eyes. "You can't stop," the little girl whispered. "You can't give up." She hugged tighter. "You still have me, and baby brother, and the other 3. We're all here. We're not letting go." June felt something inside her crack, not in weakness, but in aching resolve. The girl lifted her chin, blinking against the sun. "We need you, Mama, so you gotta keep walking, please." June pressed her free hand to her daughter's tangled hair, fingers trembling. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to scream. She wanted her husband alive, the trail safe, the children fed, the world different. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the warm, stubborn weight of her daughter's arms, the tiny breaths of the infant on her chest, the hopeful, frightened eyes of the 3 orphans watching her every move. June swallowed hard. Then she tightened her grip on the rope. She pulled, one step, then another, and another. Behind her, the wagon groaned. The children steadied themselves. The wind carried dust, but also something else, something like a promise that the trail did not end here. Under the blistering Arizona sun, June Whitaker kept going. For her child, for the baby pressed to her heart, for the 3 who had no one else, for the family fate had forced together. She kept walking, because stopping wasn't an option. The desert stretched on, endless and bone-dry. The wagon creaked faintly behind June as she stumbled along the winding trail. Each step burned, her belly pulled downward with weight and heat. The baby against her chest had stopped crying. That worried her more than any scream ever could. Ahead, a squat circle of stones marked the remnants of a well. She almost didn't believe it. June dropped the rope from her shoulders and half crawled to the well's edge. The children stayed on the wagon, silent, their faces drawn. Dust caked their lips and eyelashes. She peered into the well. No bucket, no pulley, just a few inches of muddy water at the bottom. With shaking arms, she lowered herself down as far as she could go. She cupped her hands and scooped the water, warm, gritty, and brown. "It's okay," she whispered to the baby. "It's water, sweetheart. It's water." She poured it slowly into his mouth, drop by drop. His tongue moved weakly. Her hands trembled harder. Her vision swam. Her head dipped lower, nearly touching the stone edge. Her body sagged, knees buckling in the dirt. When she looked up, there was a man. He sat astride a dark chestnut horse, no more than 20 feet away, motionless as a rock in the sun. The light from behind framed him in silhouette, but not enough to hide the truth. His left sleeve hung empty, pinned just above the elbow. No weapons were raised, no badge gleamed, no threat showed in his stance. Just a weather-faded shirt, boots scuffed from miles of travel, and eyes that looked like they had stared too long at the horizon and never found what they were searching for. June pulled the baby tight against her chest. "Don't come closer," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't have anything left to steal." The man did not move. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung a leather satchel from his saddle horn. He reached in and pulled out a full canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle. He set them gently on the ground, then backed his horse up 2 steps. No words. June blinked hard, confused by the lack of threat. "Who are you?" she asked. Still nothing. Then, finally, his voice, low, dry, rough like gravel. "Name's Weston Hale, just passing through." He looked past her, to the wagon and the children who stared back at him with sunburnt faces and hollow eyes. "You alone?" he asked. June nodded. "Since Yuma." She didn't offer more. He didn't press. Her body wavered. She tried to rise but staggered. Her knees hit the dust again. Weston slid down from his saddle, but he did not rush to her. He did not touch her. He walked to the wagon, looked it over, and then turned to his horse. He removed the saddle with practiced ease, pulled a length of rope from his pack. Without a word, he tied the rope to the front of the wagon and began fastening it to the harness rig on his mare. June stared at him, dazed. What are you doing?" Weston looked at her once, the kind of look a man gives when he's already made up his mind. "You want to keep moving," he said simply. "I can help you do that." He did not ask for permission. He did not ask for her name. He did not ask for a story. June stood, still swaying, and watched as he checked the knots and fed the mare a chunk of dried apple from his pocket. Then he picked up the rope with one hand and started walking, not riding. He walked alongside the wagon, the same slow pace she had taken, step for step. The baby shifted in her arms. The wind blew softer. After a long while, June spoke. "Why?" Weston didn't look back. "I do not know who you are," he said, "but if you want to live another day, come with me." The wagon creaked forward. The dust settled behind them. And for the first time in days, June Whitaker followed someone instead of being chased by shadows. The wind howled across the high ridge, pulling at the edges of June's shawl as she stepped onto a patch of dry earth beneath a gnarled cottonwood tree. Her legs trembled from fatigue and weight, but she stood, eyes darting to the makeshift shelter ahead. Weston Hale dropped the canvas sack from his shoulder and looked around. "This spot's high. No snakes. Close to water if it rains." It was a plateau tucked between 2 narrow cliffs, with scattered brush and stones. At its center stood a broken hunting shelter, nothing but a bent frame of wood and a torn flap of hide. He got to work without waiting for her approval. Using salvaged branches and a roll of old canvas, he braced the sides, patched the roof with stretched cowhide, and weighed the corners down with rocks. June, though visibly worn and carrying a child in her belly, washed a soot-covered pot by the stream and gathered dry kindling. The children sat in a circle, clutching their crusts of cornbread Weston had brought. The boy in her arms, barely 4 months old, gurgled as June fed him warm rice water Weston had simmered gently over the fire. He used a carved wooden spoon, his movements deliberate but unassuming. The sun dipped low. A thin blanket of stars slowly emerged above them as Weston handed out one threadbare blanket to each child. The night air cooled quickly, and the youngest girl, a slender thing with ash-colored braids, huddled beneath hers, clutching it like armor. As Weston passed by, adjusting the wind flap, the little girl looked up at him. "If my mama was still alive, would you have saved her too?" Weston stopped mid-step. He knelt, rough hands awkward against the softness of her hair. His voice was low. "If I knew someone needed saving, I would not have walked past." The girl blinked slowly, then closed her eyes, curling into the blanket. June, watching from the shadows, swallowed a knot in her throat. Later that night, long after the children had curled around the dwindling fire, June lay awake. The baby slept against her chest. The others stirred lightly, murmuring in sleep. She sat up slowly. Across the small clearing, Weston sat alone beside the fire, blade in hand, sharpening a small skinning knife on a flat river stone. Sparks danced behind him, the flames flickering across his face. There was no cruelty in it, only silence, solitude, and a kind of tired vigilance. June whispered, barely audible, "Do you ever sleep?" Weston did not look up. "Only when it rains." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you. For the blankets, for the food, for the way you talk to them like they matter." He stopped sharpening, eyes still fixed on the knife. "They do matter." A long silence passed. Coyotes yipped in the far-off hills. June's voice cracked. One of them asked if they were leftovers, like scraps from someone else's table. Weston finally looked up. "They're not." She nodded slowly, eyes wet. That night, no more words were exchanged, but as the fire burned lower, June lay back down, and for the first time in days, she closed her eyes without fear. Weston sat through the night, one hand on the knife, the other resting beside him, open, not ready to hold anything, but ready to protect. The storm rolled in fast. It began with a low growl, far-off thunder crawling across the darkening sky. Then came the wind, sharp and wild, rattling branches and snapping the edges of the canvas like angry sails. June clutched the baby tighter to her chest, blinking against the dust whipped into the air. The 3-year-old let out a scream. "Mama, the sky's breaking." June reached for him, pulling him close. The other children huddled together under the patched shelter, eyes wide. Then the rain came. Not a drizzle, but a roar. Sheets of cold water fell from the heavens, pounding the makeshift roof. Within moments, the ground was slick, the air thick with mud and lightning. June tried to calm the children, rocking gently, whispering old lullabies, but one corner of the canvas flapped loose in the chaos, and with a snap, the bunched edge peeled back, letting rain spill in. "Weston!" she cried, voice barely heard above the storm. He was already moving. Without a word, Weston stepped out into the downpour. He wore no coat. His shirt was gone. Rain soaked him instantly, plastering dark hair to his neck. But he did not falter. He grabbed the corner of the loose canvas, yanked it down, and anchored it with his body against the wind. Then, fingers fumbling in the wet, he tied it to a nearby tree root with thick cord, pulling it taut until the water ran off instead of in. Thunder cracked above him. When he returned to the tent, his hands were shaking. He crouched beside June and, without speaking, unbuckled the dry hide coat he had left folded in the corner. He wrapped it around her shoulders, gently, but with a firm tug to make sure it held. His fingers brushed hers. They were ice. June turned her face away, trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper. She buried her face into the corner of the cloth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Weston sat beside the fire pit, now steaming and half dead. He did not ask what was wrong, he just sat. Rainwater ran down his jaw in rivulets. Then, as if the storm had pulled something loose inside him, he spoke. "My little sister," he said softly, not looking at anyone. "She died from the fever. Spring of '71. She was 9. The fire popped. I left home after that. Couldn't take the quiet in the house. My folks, they never looked at each other again. The tent was still. Even the storm seemed to hush. One of the little girls, maybe 6 years old, crawled forward through the blankets. She moved slowly, eyes cautious. Then, wordlessly, she nestled against Weston's side, resting her head against his soaked shirt. Weston stiffened. His hand hovered in the air, unsure. Then he let it fall, lightly, on the girl's back, a slow, awkward pat. He did not speak again. June watched from across the tent, her baby now asleep against her chest. She saw a man not made of stone, but shaped by silence, a man whose grief had no name, only motion, action, protection. Outside, the rain eased. The worst of it had passed. But something else had shifted in the dark, something between them, between all of them, and it had nothing to do with the storm. The morning sun broke through in golden streaks across the hills. The storm had passed, but puddles still clung to the roots and hollows. Weston rose early, checked the snares, and returned with 2 rabbits strung over his shoulder. He cleaned and dressed them quietly, set them to roast on hot, flat stones by the fire pit, the smell of meat rich and sharp in the crisp air. The children stirred at the scent, blinking awake with hopeful eyes. For the first time in weeks, they had meat, warm, seasoned with salt and herbs. June had foraged days ago. They ate in silence, chewing slow, savoring every bite. One of the boys, perhaps 6 or 7, followed Weston later as he crouched near the horseshoe stake, reshaping a bent iron shoe. "Mister?" the boy asked, scuffing his feet. Weston did not look up. "Yes? Why don't you live with nobody?" Weston let out a quiet, scratchy laugh. "'Cause no one ever figured out how to live with me." The boy tilted his head. "You're not mean." "No," Weston said, hammering softly, "but I'm not easy either." That seemed to satisfy the child, who wandered off after a beetle crawling near the rocks. Later that afternoon, June sat on a blanket under the largest oak, teaching the children how to twist grasses into garlands. She tied 3 loops, showed them how to weave dried flowers into the strands. "We may not have walls," she said, fingers steady, "but we've got hands, and hands can build a roof if they stay together." The children didn't say much, but they watched and copied and smiled when their rings held together without falling apart. Night fell slowly, wrapped in the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. The fire burned low. The baby slept sound against June's shoulder. Weston sharpened his blade by the last light. The children curled up in a tangle of blankets. June adjusted her blanket, trying to shift her weight from one hip to the other. Her back ached. The baby kicked. Then, scratching. Soft, slow. Right outside the tent flap, June froze. The noise came again. A low, ragged clawing, like something dragging itself across the canvas. Her breath caught. She backed away instinctively, one hand around her belly, the other clutching the edge of the blanket. Weston moved instantly. He stepped in front of her without a word. One arm reached across, shielding her stomach with a firm, deliberate motion. The other slipped down to the knife at his boot. They waited, breath held. Then, whine. A soft, rasping whimper. Weston crouched and gently pushed aside the flap. A dog, skin and bones, coat patchy, ribs clear beneath the fur. Its eyes, wide and unsure, darted from Weston to the children inside. It did